Justice Department is now preparing criminal charges against Edward Snowden. He is the former CIA employee who admits leaking secret documents that reveal government surveillance of phone records for millions of Americans.
Glenn Greenwald is the journalist responsible for releasing the information leaked by Edward Snowden.
I'm talking about Greenwald, where you have someone who's disclosed secrets like this and threatens to release more. Legal action should be taken against him.
U.S. investigators are now trying to find out as much as possible about Snowden and his role in what many already consider one of the most significant intelligence leaks in American history.
Sylvester, come here. No jumping, assholes. No jumping, noob. They're all rescue dogs from the streets. We've had more, actually, but we found homes for them. We've picked up a couple of really old dogs on the street who have died, and so it fluctuates the number. I remember the first time I came to Rio de Janeiro, I thought, I don't see how I'm ever going to go visit another place ever again, because every time I have time and the ability to travel, I'm always going to want to come here. And then in 2005, I had pretty much decided that I wanted to do something other than law and wanted to just kind of figure out what to do with my life. And so I rented an apartment here for 7 weeks. And then on the second day, I met my partner, David, and we fell in love really quickly. For 8 years, we were waiting for the Defense of Marriage Act, which is the law that kept us from living in the United States, to be struck down so that we would at least have the option of considering whether or not we would want to move to the United States. And literally the month that it was struck down, which I think was July, arose this other obstacle to our returning to the United States, which was the prospect that I might be arrested the minute I get off the plane as a result of the journalism I've been doing. The UK and US governments hate the journalism that we're doing. What they want to do is what they always try to do in these cases, which is use intimidation and bullying to scare people who are going to continue to do the reporting out of doing the reporting. And so taking my partner and putting him in a room and detaining him for what effectively was 11 hours under a terrorism law, basically branding him a terrorist, which is what they're now doing, saying that the publication of these materials is tantamount to terrorism, is a way of flaunting their power, of saying that, look at what it is that we can do to people who defy us if we choose. At the time that it happened, I was angry. I felt helpless. I was furious that they would target somebody peripheral to these events instead of me or Laura or the other journalists with whom we've been working. But at the same time, I found it incredibly emboldening because to me, they showed their true face to the world and to me about how abusive they are when it comes to the exercise of their power. And that made me know just how compelling it was to continue to bring transparency to what it is that they're doing, and it showed why they can't be trusted to exercise power without transparency and accountability. What motivated you to focus on surveillance and privacy?
I think privacy is something that is essential to who we are as human beings and is indispensable to pretty much every other single form of human freedom and what it means to be a free, prosperous, creative human being. And the dangers of having the privacy eroded are sometimes elusive for people, and yet incredibly profound. A society in which you think or know that you're always being watched is a society that will breed conformity, because when you know that you're always being watched, as all kinds of psychological studies show, as all kinds of other social science demonstrates, when you know that you're being watched, you make choices that you believe are the ones that the judgment of society demands that you make. It's only when you can behave and choose and explore when, without judgmental eyes being cast upon you, that's really the realm in which dissent and creativity and exploration exclusively reside. So there are all kinds of obvious political dangers to having privacy eroded, but there are also really significant harms on the human and individual and personal level. And there aren't very many people articulating its value or defending it from erosion, and so I just perceive this need in defense of this value that I consider to be one of the most important.
Is it true you ran for city council at 17?
That is true. I grew up in South Florida, in a Fort Lauderdale suburb. My grandfather was on the city council and was sort of this insurgent outsider candidate and waged all these wars and vendettas against various factions in the city. Even though it was this sort of small town, the theme very much was that there was this faction in the city, these sort of old, retired, wealthier New Yorkers who moved down to Florida to retire, and they, because of their numbers and their organization and their voting behavior, exercised much greater power over the city than all of the factions. And my grandfather felt like they had been abusing their power at the expense of more marginalized groups, and wanted to defend the marginalized groups against this abuse of power. Because of the kind of politician that he was, which is sort of very contentious and aggressive, there was always high drama surrounding the meetings and the campaigns. And so, you know, as someone who was 6 and 7, just sort of a kid, it became kind of interesting because it wasn't these dull, boring zoning board debates, but they were, you know, kind of these cultural clashes that were entertaining in their own way. And then I went to George Washington University and then NYU School of Law.
Is there a reason when you look back that made you choose journalism over law?
I think the first thing that really made me focus on political debates in a way that I had pretty much ignored for a good while I was in law school and then building my law practice was the arrest of Jose Padilla, who was an American citizen arrested at Chicago International Airport, so on American soil, branded the dirty bomber by John Ashcroft in a hastily called press conference in Moscow, and then instead of charging him with crimes, he was declared an enemy combatant unilaterally by George Bush and then put into a military break for 3.5 years without charges or even access to a lawyer.
They're not common criminals. They're enemy combatants and terrorists who are being detained for acts of war against our country. And that is why different rules have to apply.
Watching the United States arresting and imprisoning American citizens on U.S. soil without charges or even an access to a lawyer, and watching there be almost no backlash, no media objection, is really the first thing that kind of underscored for me how extremist things had become. And yeah, the general mindset under the war on terror that the rule of law, that constitutional constraints really are too insignificant to acknowledge as valid, and that instead the only value that matters and that trumps all others is this very narrow conception of security. And that was really the climate in which I became much more politically attentive and decided that I wanted to do more. Over time, I realized that you can only make an impact on any single political issue if you start understanding and confronting and then ultimately subverting the patterns of how media institutions function. And once I really started engaging with media institutions, it was sort of a gradual process where I started not only developing theories about how journalism should function, but then doing the kind of journalism that I thought was needed.
They're going to say, you know, I've aided our enemies in making them aware of these systems, but that argument can be made against anybody who reveals.
One of the most disorienting moments I've had of my life, let alone the past 5 months, was the moment I met Snowden, because I had spent a good amount of time with him talking to him online, but I knew nothing about him demographically. I didn't know how old he was or what he looked like or much of what he had done. And for multiple reasons, my assumption was that he was in his late 50s or 60s, because he just seemed very senior in terms of his access to documents, but more importantly, the sophisticated nature of his insights. And so when I met this kid who, although 29, looked at least 5 years younger, you know, very thin and pale and kind of wearing jeans and a t-shirt, it was shocking. It was very disorienting because the expectation that I had of who he was going to be was so vastly different from his reality, and it made me start wondering whether this was going to be what I actually was hoping it would be. I realized that he had documents that the world should see. He had information that the public had a right to know. I was confident in the veracity of his claims and in the authenticity of his motives, and came to see that he was completely trustworthy and that I could work with him to do what journalists should do, which is inform the public about what the world's most powerful factions are doing in the dark. in many instances, metadata is actually more invasive than listening to the content of your calls or reading your email. Metadata is the data about your communication. So instead of listening to your phone calls and hearing what you're saying in the phone call or reading your email, which is content, they will collect the information I just described. Who it is who's calling you, how often they're calling you, the duration of the call, where they are when they call you, who you're emailing, who's emailing you, what machines you're using, where you are physically when you do it. For instance, if you are a woman who is making an appointment to have an abortion, and you call an abortion clinic, and someone's listening to that call, they're not going to hear anything other than, hi, I'd like to make an appointment for 2 o'clock tomorrow. If, though, that person is monitoring the metadata of the call, they will see that this woman has called an abortion clinic. Or if you're somebody with HIV and making an appointment to talk to your HIV doctor, listening to the content of the call will reveal very little. Listening, but knowing the metadata of who you're calling will reveal that you're going to see an HIV doctor. Same with human rights activists talking to informants in dangerous places. Metadata allows the government to know far more about you in many instances than even the content does. And what it also does is it enables them to create a huge picture of your life, of who your associations are, who the people that you talk to, what your network of friends is. Very, very complete picture of what your life is without having to read a single email or listen to a call.
But what would you say to someone, as lots of people are saying, I don't really care if my stuff is being read or looked at, I've got nothing to hide?
So there are a lot of people who say this, but I think there are very, very, very few people who believe it. Every time somebody has said that to me, I don't really care who sees what I'm doing because I have nothing to hide. I've asked that person in probably thousands of cases now in the last year alone, please send me the passwords to all of your emails and social media accounts so that I can just troll through them at will and publish whatever it is that I want. And literally not one single person has taken me up on it. Because even though we are social creatures and political animals who need human interaction and need some sort of public identity, equally essential to who we are is a private realm. And that's always been true. Human beings have always sought out privacy. It's just intrinsic to our nature. And so I think lots of people who say that, it's something easy to say, it's sort of cute to say it, but people instinctively know that it's false, and their actions prove that. Huge numbers of people around the world, hundreds of millions, probably billions, use Google and Yahoo for their online activities. The fact that the U.S. government is essentially breaking into the systems, the pathways in which this data is transported, which enables them to bulk vacuum all of it, shows the mindset of the NSA that they are truly interested in eliminating privacy globally, by which I mean that they want all forms of human electronic communication to be vulnerable to their surveillance net. The fact that they do this even while they have the PRISM system in place, which already enables them to acquire vast sums of information from the NSA, from the internet companies rather, from their servers, is something that just shows how extreme they become in terms of institutional devotion to gathering as much as they can.
And what about people who say this is a necessary evil because there are lots of people out there plotting to attack us?
Well, first of all, we make those kind of judgments all the time. So if, for example, we installed monitors in everybody's home and enabled authorized police to enter people's homes at will, no warrant needed, no knocking at the door, just enter in whenever you want, there's no question that crime would go way down. It would be much harder to be a rapist or a pedophile or a murderer and evade capture if there were monitors everywhere that were constantly being scrutinized and the police had the ability to just simply enter everybody's home. But we don't make that choice because we would rather have a higher risk of criminality rather than live in a society in which privacy has been completely destroyed. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is a huge amount of the spying that we're talking about has nothing to do with terrorism or national security. It has to do with economic espionage. It has to do with monitoring the population indiscriminately to augment the power of those who control the spying machine. Terrorism is the fear-mongering slogan that those in power have used over the last 12 years to engender submission to authority. It has nothing to do with the reality of why the spying program is actually been constructed, and the proof of that is that it's very rarely directed at actual terrorists, and far more often than not at people who have no conceivable relation to terrorism at all. If you go and look at the debates over the Patriot Act, the people who were standing up and saying this is a radical piece of legislation, this is really dangerous, it's an abandonment of all of our values, they didn't anticipate that the Patriot Act would be used for the collection of everybody's communication. Even those people painting the grimmest and shrillest picture about what the Patriot Act would lead to were warning that it had lowered the standard too much from probable cause to just relevance, so that it would enable the government to target people too easily. But everybody assumed, even the most ardent opponents of the Patriot Act, that it was still going to be targeted investigations. Nobody ever thought the Patriot Act would be distorted and misinterpreted to authorize and justify bulk, indiscriminate, suspicionless collection of the communication data of every single American citizen, as it has been. There's no question that the more you collect, the harder it is to find the things that they claim they're trying to find. So if you're collecting, as the NSA is, 1.9 billion emails and telephone calls every single day, and close to 25 billion emails and telephone calls around the world every single day, the problem that you have is that you're collecting so much that you can't even actually store it, which is why they're building this massive facility in Bluffdale, Utah, that is designed to store everything that they're collecting. It becomes increasingly difficult to find the actual terrorist attacks. The analogy they always use is looking for the needle in a haystack. The more hay you collect, the huger the haystack is, the harder it is to find the needle. That's why it's so obvious that terrorism is not the driving force behind this system.
So if the motive isn't to stop terrorism, what is the motive?
If you are somebody who exercises power, and you can know everything about what everybody else is doing, what they say, what they read, what they think, what they plan, with whom they're interacting, and then at the same time build a wall of secrecy around what it is that you're doing so that nobody can actually see or know what it is that you're choosing, the power imbalance becomes amazingly acute, which is why all tyrannies instinctively use surveillance as one of their principal weapons, because the more you know about the world and about other people, the more you can manipulate and control it. The less that world knows about you, the less leverage they have over you. And so it's really at its core about simply increasing the power of the United States government vis-a-vis its own population and populations around the world.
So is America becoming a tyranny?
I mean, I think these labels are sometimes unhelpful just because words like that are so inflammatory, and I think people are inculcated to be, they're sort of trained to believe that tyranny is something that happens in places like China and Iran and Russia and not in nice Western countries like the United States. So the minute you apply that label, people react instinctively as though you've said something radical and their brain shuts. What I can say for sure is that there are powers that are the hallmark of tyranny, one of which is mass, indiscriminate, suspicionless surveillance that the United States government is increasingly relying upon to maintain control and to shield itself from legitimate challenge. And whether somebody wants to call that tyranny or not, I'll leave that semantic debate to others, but that power is clearly tyrannical in nature.
In the fallout from Snowden's revelations, Brazil is now demanding an explanation over reports that the NSA monitored its citizens' phone calls and emails for a decade.
It isn't just that enemy heads of state or enemy military officials are being surveilled. It is even the democratically elected leaders of America's closest allies. We reported here that Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil's email accounts have been targeted for interception, that the president of Mexico, when he was running for election, had similar kind of targeting. Obviously, Angela Merkel in Germany had her cell phone for 10 years before she was even chancellor targeted and the content of those calls intercepted.
What do you make of Obama's claim that he didn't know Angela Merkel was being hacked?
It's hard to say. I don't know which is worse. I mean, if you have a program that targets the democratically elected leader of one of your closest allies, you would think that the commander-in-chief of that agency would be aware of something that significant. And if he was aware of it, as a lot of sources indicate that he was, and approved it and is now lying about it, that's obviously quite problematic. At the same time, if the agency just went off and did it on its own, which I actually believe is plausible given what a rogue agency they are, without telling Obama or the White House that they were doing it, they just took it on themselves to go do something that profoundly significant, that might even be more disturbing. But ultimately what it reflects is that this is a community completely out of control.
Were you shocked at the way much of mainstream media criminalized you, like David Gregory on Meet the Press?
No, I wasn't shocked. I saw what happened with WikiLeaks when they did what the U.S. media pretends to do and ought to do, which is bring transparency to the national security state, and watch as American journalists didn't just tolerate the idea that WikiLeaks should be criminalized for doing journalism, but led the chorus calling for Julian Assange's head. And I knew that once I started to do this reporting in the way that I intended to do it, even though I was more protective than Julian because I'm perceived as more of a journalist in the traditional sense because I worked for a large newspaper at the time. I've been writing a column for a long time. I was a lawyer before that. I'm less easily demonizable than Julian because I was born in the United States. I knew that at some point we would reach a line where American journalists would start to say this is something other than journalism. There's a big difference between rationally expecting a certain development and then viscerally living it. So if you go on Meet the Press, which is sort of the belly of the official Washington beast, it's where, you know, the most powerful Washington officials gather to disseminate their propaganda collaboratively. And to sort of be invited into that circle for the first time and then held up as this person about whom there's a debate, said David Gregory, whether or not I was even a journalist at all, and that perhaps I should be imprisoned.
To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
To have another person who calls themselves a journalist make those kind of claims about you in a setting like that is somewhat jarring. When media figures advocate that, it's the height of hypocrisy because Washington functions almost exclusively through leaks. That's what the currency in Washington is who knows what secrets. And the people that Washington journalists idolize violate secrecy laws all the time. Bob Woodward has become the most celebrated and the richest journalist in the world by publishing book after book that contain some of America's most sensitive secrets that he just spills. And none of these journalists would ever dare suggest that Bob Woodward or his sources ought to be prosecuted. Obama aides run to the New York Times constantly and leak information about the drone program or the killing of bin Laden or a whole variety of other classified programs. When doing so, glorifies President Obama or serves his political interest. Nobody has ever suggested that those officials be prosecuted, and there are no leak investigations, serious ones, pending against the people who have done that, because leaks that serve the state, that promote the interests of those in power, are not only tolerated, but glorified in official Washington circles. The only time they get angry about leaks are leaks that undermine the interests of those in power, like the ones done by WikiLeaks, like the ones that we're doing. And what this shows is that all of these rules that official Washington claims to believe in, they don't actually believe in them. They are rules that are manipulated to promote the power of those with the greatest authority in Washington and punish those who challenge them in any way. When the New York Times in December 2005 revealed that the Bush administration had been spying on Americans and their conversations without the warrants required by the criminal law for many years, and it was subsequently revealed that the New York Times actually had learned about that 15 months earlier, but the executive editor of the New York Times, who at the time was Bill Keller, and the publisher were called into the Oval Office of the Bush White House and told by George Bush that they should suppress that story, that essentially national security would be jeopardized if they reported it. And it was on its face a completely ridiculous claim, the idea that national security would be jeopardized if Americans learned that they were being spied on without warrants. But the New York Times did suppress the story, let George Bush stand for re-election and get re-elected, knowing this but keeping it from their readers, and then ultimately they published it only because the reporter, Jim Rison, had lost his patience and had written a book in which he was going to break the story anyway, and the New York Times just didn't want to get scooped by their own reporter in his book. And the Times then published it and won the Pulitzer Prize for it. And that showed how the White House could take the most powerful and influential media organization in the United States, probably in the world, the New York Times, and induce them without much effort to conceal a huge major story simply by invoking this mantra of national security. And the New York Times chose to remain more loyal to the White House than to their own readers and to the country. And that really, I think, for me, underscored the hierarchy of their value system.
Do you think as time goes on, more people will continue to regret their condemnation of Snowden?
I think some people will. I think there are a lot of journalists in particular who simply identify overwhelmingly with the state. And so anybody who takes action that undermines the interest of those in power within the state apparatus is somebody who will be viewed as a villain with hostility by those journalists, which is ironic given that that's the role that journalists are actually supposed to play. So I don't think those kinds of journalists, like a David Brooks or David Gregory or Bob Schaefer, the kind of like journalists who are basically just mouthpieces of political power, will ever come to change their minds. But I do think a lot of people, as these revelations have emerged, have come to see that there really is this system that is extremely menacing and that they ought to have known about, and understand that the only reason they now know about it is because of Edward Snowden's courage and sacrifice. And I think there are a lot of people who are reevaluating their originally negative views of him and are coming to appreciate and have gratitude for what he did. I left The Guardian, in essence, because there was this opportunity that was impossible to decline, which was the ability to create an entirely new news organization unencumbered by any existing institutional strictures and free to pursue journalism in wholly new and innovative ways, and to be part of an institution that's really devoted from the very start to not just tolerating, but to protecting and fortifying and fostering and encouraging and even demanding independent, adversarial, aggressive journalism. And so to be able to be a part of something like that from the ground up, to help find the people that are going to be part of it, to help shape how it works and functions, what its ethos is, and then to be able to do my journalism in the context of this structure that I've helped to build, that's incredibly well funded at the same time, and yet designed to, give voice to dissident voices and to do that kind of journalism, was just sort of this once-in-a-career opportunity that would have been, I think anybody would have had a hard time rejecting. And, the touchstone will always have to be that the journalism has to be grounded in very clear and verifiable facts and data. But beyond that, I think the journalists should be able to pursue the path that they want to take and have an institution that's designed to support that.
Pierre Omidyar founded eBay. eBay owns PayPal, which cut off support for WikiLeaks. Did this affect your decision to work with him?
It affected my decision to work with him in the sense that I talked to him about it, because it was a concern of mine, because PayPal, what PayPal did along with Amazon and MasterCard and Visa in succumbing to U.S. government pressure was pernicious. It was dangerous. It was completely unjustifiable. And in fact, at the time, I denounced it really vehemently. And then I co-founded a group, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, that was designed to destroy those kind of blockades by raising money for any group that's targeted. And so it was a concern to me. And what Pierre said was that when that happened, he had no operational control over eBay or PayPal. He was no longer the CEO. He had given up all forms of managerial responsibility. He was, though, the chairman of eBay, and as his largest stockholder, obviously has a voice. And so I wanted to know whether he had spoken out against it. And there was a newspaper that he founded in Honolulu that was designed to do investigative journalism, which editorialized against the government's blockade. And he told me that he was opposed to the decision and showed me that editorial. And, there are people who say that he could have done more and should have done more, and that's perfectly reasonable criticism to make. But I also know that Pierre has been affected in lots of ways by the reporting of the last 6 months, by the threats posed to privacy and press freedom. And, if someone can show me the perfect human being with whom I can work in a meaningful way on my journalism, or the perfect newspaper I'll be happy to take a look. But we're all imperfect human beings. And my issue with working with other people has always been very simple, which is I have full and complete editorial independence that nobody can interfere with. And as long as people honor that, then the fact that, they may be subject to reasonable criticism is perfectly fine with me.
What have we learned from Edward Snowden?
I think the most important thing we've learned from Edward Snowden is that there really are no limits on the power of a single individual, any individual, to change the world. He was somebody who had very little position or power. He was just an ordinary employee of a defense contractor, grew up in this lower middle class family whose father worked for the Coast Guard for 30 years, was pretty ordinary in every single way, except that he made this choice that was incredibly brave and self-sacrificing to combat an injustice that he felt he could not live with himself the rest of his life had he allowed to persist. And through this choice, he has really fundamentally changed the world on many different levels. And the fact that he has done that, I think, is a really strong antidote to the temptation of defeatism, the idea that these institutions are so formidable and so powerful that nothing can be done to subvert them. He's, I think, given the ultimate and permanent antidote to that mindset.